let me tell you about a place. A place where the trees grow so tall they blot out the sun, where the air is thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and where silence reigns supreme. It's the kind of place city folks dream about, a refuge from the noise and the chaos, a place to find peace, or so they think. This is the story of Sarah, a graphic designer from Los Angeles. She wasn't running from something, not exactly. She was running to something. Quiet. After a particularly nasty bout of anxiety, triggered by the constant barrage of city noise, car alarms, sirens, construction, the never-ending hum of humanity, she decided she'd had enough. Her therapist suggested a change of scenery, a radical shift. And Sarah, she took that advice to heart. She found it online, a small, rustic cabin nestled deep in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. Remote, secluded, off-grid. The listing described it as a writer's retreat, a nature lover's paradise. The photos showed a cozy, wood-paneled interior, a stone fireplace, and windows looking out onto a seemingly endless expanse of forest. No neighbors in sight. Perfect. Sarah packed her bags, loaded up her trusty Subaru, and drove north. It was a long drive, but as she left the sprawling suburbs behind and climbed higher into the mountains, she felt a sense of lightness, a lifting of the weight she'd been carrying for so long. The last few miles were the toughest. The paved road turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to a narrow, winding track that barely qualified as a road at all. Her GPS signal flickered and died. But finally there was the cabin. It was even more charming in person than in the pictures. Built of solid logs, with a moss-covered roof and a porch swing overlooking a small, clear stream. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, a place where time stood still. The first few days were blissful. Sarah spent her time exploring the woods, reading by the fire, and simply reveling in the silence. She slept soundly, undisturbed by any sound except the gentle patter of rain on the roof or the hooting of an owl in the distance. It was exactly what she needed. The cabin had limited electricity, powered by a generator that she only used sparingly. No cell service, of course. She was truly cut off from the world, and for the first time in a long time, she felt safe. About a week after she arrived, she heard a knock on the door. It was a startling sound, breaking the quiet that had become so familiar. She hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing her mind. Who could it be? She opened the door cautiously, peering out into the dappled sunlight. Standing on her porch was a woman, an older woman, with long, stringy gray hair and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. She was wearing a faded flannel shirt, worn jeans, and sturdy hiking boots. She held a woven basket in her hands. "Afternoon," the woman said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I'm Martha. I live down the way." She gestured vaguely with her chin towards the dense woods. Sarah managed a smile. "Hi, Martha. I'm Sarah." Martha didn't smile back. She just stared at Sarah, her eyes intense and unwavering. It was unnerving. "You new here," Martha stated. It was not a question. "Yes," Sarah replied. "I just moved in last week." Martha nodded slowly, as if absorbing this information. Then, she thrust the basket toward Sarah. "Take this," she said. "Welcome gift." Sarah hesitated. The gesture was kind, but there was something off about Martha, something unsettling. Still, she couldn't refuse. She took the basket, her fingers brushing against Martha's cold, calloused hand. "Thank you," Sarah said. "That's very kind of you." Martha didn't respond. She just continued to stare, her gaze unwavering. The silence stretched, becoming increasingly awkward. Finally, Martha spoke. "These woods, they're not like the city," she said, her voice low and gravelly. "You gotta be careful out here. Keep your doors locked. Keep your windows shut. And listen to the woods." Sarah frowned slightly. "Listen to the woods?" Martha nodded. "They'll tell you what you need to know, if you listen close enough." She paused, her eyes darting towards the trees, as if expecting to see something. "There are things out here, things you don't understand." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What was this woman talking about? Was she just a harmless, eccentric local? Or was there something more to her warning? I appreciate that," Sarah said, trying to sound polite but also wanting to end the conversation. "I'll keep that in mind." Martha didn't seem to hear her. She was still staring at the woods, her expression unreadable. Then, abruptly, she turned and started walking away, disappearing into the trees as quickly and silently as she had appeared. Sarah watched her go, feeling a mixture of confusion and unease. She closed the door, locking it securely, and leaned against it, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She looked down at the basket. It was filled with jars of homemade preserves, blackberry, raspberry, huckleberry. A nice gesture, certainly, but Martha's words, her warning, they lingered in the air, casting a shadow over the peaceful solitude Sarah had sought. She couldn't shake the image of the old woman's strange and weathered face. She put the basket on the kitchen counter, deciding to deal with it later. Right now, she needed to calm her nerves. She went outside, sat on the porch swing, and took a deep breath of the cool mountain air. But even the beauty of the surroundings couldn't fully dispel the sense of unease that had settled over her. Martha's visit had changed something. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not by Martha, perhaps, but by something else. Something hidden in the depths of the woods. Something that the woods themselves were trying to warn her about. But she also had a feeling that it was not the woods that she needed to be concerned about, but the strange woman. What was that all about? The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and deep, bruised blue. The beauty was almost painful, a stark contrast to the knot of anxiety tightening in Sarah's stomach. She couldn't shake Martha's words, her strange demeanor, the way she'd seemed to know something Sarah didn't. Sarah went back inside, the cozy cabin suddenly feeling less welcoming, more like a fragile box against the encroaching darkness. She lit the oil lamps, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. She checked the locks on the doors and windows, even though she knew it was probably pointless. If someone or something wanted to get in, they would. She tried to distract herself. She opened her laptop, intending to do some work, but the words on the screen blurred before her eyes. Her mind kept replaying Martha's visit, her cryptic warnings. Listen to the woods. There are things out here. What things? Wild animals? Sure, there were bears and mountain lions in these mountains, but Martha hadn't seemed to be talking about wildlife. She'd spoken of something else, something more sinister. Sarah closed her laptop, giving up on work. She paced the small cabin, her restlessness growing. She wished she had cell service, even just a bar or two. She wanted to call someone, anyone, just to hear a friendly voice, to reassure herself that the outside world still existed. She decided to make some tea, hoping the warmth would calm her nerves. As she waited for the water to boil, she glanced out the kitchen window. The woods were now shrouded in darkness, a black, impenetrable wall surrounding the cabin. And then she saw it, a flicker of movement, a shadow just at the edge of the trees. Sarah froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She strained her eyes, trying to see through the darkness. Was it just her imagination? A trick of the light? No. There was again, a figure moving slowly, stealthily among the trees. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was definitely there. Someone or something was watching her. Sarah backed away from the window, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She felt a surge of panic, a desperate urge to flee. But where could she go? She was miles from anywhere, surrounded by miles of dark, unknown wilderness. She grabbed the largest kitchen knife she could find, her hand trembling so badly she could barely hold it. She knew it wouldn't be much of a defense, but it was better than nothing. The kettle started to whistle, its shrill sound piercing the silence. Sarah jumped, startled by the noise. She quickly turned off the stove, her ears straining for any sound from outside. Silence. She waited, holding her breath, listening intently. Nothing. Had she imagined it? Was it just an animal? She slowly approached the window again, peering out into the darkness. She couldn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched persisted, stronger than ever. She decided to barricade the door. She dragged a heavy wooden chair and placed it against the door, wedging it under the doorknob. It wasn't much, but it made her feel slightly safer. She spent the rest of the evening huddled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the knife still clutched in her hand. She didn't dare turn off the lamps. She jumped at every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadow in the woods, the glint of something in its hand, Martha's piercing gaze. As the hours crept by, Sarah's fear began to morph into something else. Anger, resentment. She'd come here for peace, for solitude. And now she was being terrorized by what? A crazy old woman? A figment of her imagination? She started to question her sanity. Was she losing it? Was the isolation getting to her? Was this all in her head? Just before dawn, she finally drifted off into a fitful sleep, exhausted by fear and anxiety. But even in her dreams, she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, the sense of impending danger lurking just beyond the edge of her awareness. She dreamt of Martha, and the old woman smiled at her, wickedly, as Sarah realized she was no longer holding a knife, but the basket of fruit. She looked up at Martha in her dream, as she saw a shadowy figure appear behind the old woman. The figure moved too fast, and the dream dissolved before she could process what happened. She woke with a start, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the gaps in the curtains. The cabin was silent, bathed in the pale, early morning light. The knife was still in her hand, her grip so tight her knuckles were white. She slowly got up, her body stiff and aching. She went to the window, cautiously peering out. The woods looked peaceful, serene, almost inviting. There was no sign of anyone or anything out of the ordinary. But Sarah knew better. The night had changed everything. The silence was no longer comforting. It was menacing. The solitude was no longer peaceful. It was terrifying. She knew she couldn't stay here. Not anymore. She had to leave. But as she looked out at the vast, impenetrable wilderness surrounding her, she wondered if she would ever truly escape the shadows of the Oregon woods and the memory of the old woman and her words. It seemed as though she had a choice to make, to confront the old woman or run. The decision was made, etched in the cold light of dawn. Sarah couldn't stay. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the cabin would be a torment. But leaving wouldn't be easy. The isolation that had once been a sanctuary was now a cage. First, she needed a plan. She couldn't just blindly stumble through the woods. She needed to get to her car, and she needed to do it without being seen. She considered waiting until nightfall, hoping for the cover of darkness. But the thought of spending another night in the cabin, knowing something was out there, was unbearable. She decided to leave now, while the sun was up. She packed a small bag, her wallet, phone useless for calls, but maybe for GPS if she got close enough to a signal, a water bottle, and a knife. She dressed in layers, choosing dark colors that would help her blend in with the shadows. Before she left, she did something she hadn't done since she arrived. She opened the basket Martha had given her. She'd been avoiding it, almost as if it were a cursed object. Now, she examined the jars of preserves. Blackberry, raspberry, huckleberry, all neatly labeled in a surprisingly elegant script. Beneath the jars, nestled in the bottom of the basket, she found something else. A small, folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map. A map of the trail surrounding the cabin, with surprisingly detailed markings. And there, marked with a small X, was a location labeled Martha's cabin. Sarah stared at the map, her mind racing. Why would Martha give her a map to her own cabin? Was it a trap? A warning? Or an invitation? A new thought struck her, a terrifying possibility. What if Martha wasn't the threat? What if she was trying to help? What if the shadow in the woods, the things she'd spoken of, were something else entirely? Something far more dangerous? Sarah felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Fear, confusion, and a flicker of hope. If Martha was on her side, then maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone. She decided to take a risk. She would follow the map. She would go to Martha's cabin. She would demand answers. With the map in one hand and the knife in the other, Sarah slipped out of the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved quickly, staying close to the trees, using them as cover. She followed the trail, constantly scanning her surroundings, listening for any sign of movement. The woods were eerily silent, the only sound her own breathing and the crunch of leaves under her feet. The sun was higher now, but the thick canopy of trees blocked most of the light, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The trail was longer and more winding than she'd expected. She'd been walking for what felt like hours, her legs aching, her throat dry. Doubt began to creep in. What if the map was a lie? What if she was walking into a trap? Just as she was about to give up, she saw it. A small clearing, and in the center, a cabin. It was even more ramshackle than her own, almost completely overgrown with vines and moss. It looked abandoned. Sarah hesitated. This couldn't be right. Martha's cabin? It looked like no one had lived here in years. She cautiously approached, her senses on high alert. The front door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. She pushed it open slowly, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dark and dusty. Cobwebs hung thick in the corners, and the air was heavy with the smell of decay. Furniture was overturned, covered in a thick layer of dust. It was clear that no one had lived here for a very long time. Sarah felt a wave of disappointment and a renewed sense of fear. She'd been wrong. Martha wasn't here. She was alone. Then, she saw something that made her blood run cold. On the floor in the center of the room was a circle of stones, and in the middle of the circle were bones. Small bones. Animal bones, she hoped, but she couldn't be sure. She backed away slowly, her eyes wide with horror. This wasn't just an abandoned cabin. This was something else. Something dark. Something evil. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. A twig snapping. She whirled around, knife raised, ready to defend herself. Standing in the doorway was Martha. She looked even older, more haggard than before. Her eyes were wild, her hair disheveled. But she wasn't looking at Sarah. She was looking past her, at the circle of stones. "You shouldn't be here," Martha said, her voice a hoarse whisper. Sarah lowered the knife slightly, her mind reeling. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What are those bones?" Martha didn't answer. She just stared at the circle, her expression unreadable. "You warned me," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "You said there were things in the woods. What are they? What's going on?" Martha finally looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of sadness and fear. "They're always here," she said, her voice barely audible. "Always watching. Always waiting." "Who?" Sarah demanded. "Who's watching?" "The ones who live in the shadows," Martha whispered. "The ones who feed on fear." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This was insane. This was like something out of a horror movie. "I don't understand," Sarah said, shaking her head. "What do they want?" "They want what everyone wants," Martha said, a strange smile playing on her lips. "To be seen, to be heard, to be remembered." Then Martha did something unexpected. She stepped aside, gesturing towards the woods behind her cabin. "Go," she said. "Follow the creek. It will lead you back to the road. Go now before they find you." Sarah hesitated. Was this another trick? Was Martha leading her into a trap? But then she saw something in Martha's eyes. Not malice, not deception, but pity and fear. Genuine fear. Sarah made a split-second decision. She trusted Martha. Or, at least, she trusted her fear. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice choked with emotion. Martha nodded, her gaze fixed on the woods. "Don't look back," she whispered. "Just go." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran, following the creek as Martha had instructed. She ran as fast as she could, her lungs burning, her legs screaming. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. She ran until she stumbled out onto the dirt road. The same road she'd driven in on what felt like a lifetime ago. She saw her car, parked just where she'd left it. She scrambled inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. She put the car in reverse and sped away, not stopping until she was miles away from the cabin, miles away from the woods, miles away from Martha. She drove until she reached the nearest town, where she finally pulled over, her body shaking uncontrollably. She called the police, reported everything she'd seen, everything Martha had told her. The police were skeptical, of course. They searched the area, but found nothing. No sign of Martha, no sign of the abandoned cabin, no sign of the circle of bones. They told her it was probably just her imagination, a product of stress and isolation. But Sarah knew better. She knew what she'd seen. She knew what she'd felt. She never went back to the cabin. She never saw Martha again. But she never forgot her. And she never forgot the woods. Years later, Sarah still lives with the memory of that terrifying experience. She's back in the city now, surrounded by the noise and the crowds, but she finds no comfort there. The silence of the woods, the sense of being watched, it still haunts her. And sometimes, when she's alone at night, she thinks she can hear Martha's voice, whispering in the darkness. Listen to the woods. They'll tell you what you need to know. But she knows it's not the woods she needs to listen to now, but the silence between the noises, because that's where the true horrors reside. The story ends, but the fear, the uncertainty, that remains. It's a reminder that some mysteries are never truly solved, some shadows never truly fade. The city was supposed to be a sanctuary. The constant hum of traffic, the chatter of crowds, the relentless glare of neon lights. All of it should have been a balm to Sarah's frayed nerves. It wasn't. The urban cacophony, which had once driven her to seek refuge in the mountains, now felt like a mocking reminder of her failure to find peace. She tried to return to her old life, her graphic design work, her friends, her routine. But it was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. She was different now. The woods had changed her. The police report had gone nowhere. A cursory search of the area near her cabin had yielded nothing. No sign of Martha. No dilapidated cabin with a circle of bones. The officers, polite but dismissive, had suggested she'd been disoriented, perhaps even hallucinating due to stress and isolation. They'd filed the report as unfounded and closed the case. Sarah had tried to explain, to convince them that what she'd experienced was real. But the more she talked, the more she sounded like a crazy person, even to her own ears. She eventually gave up, retreating into a shell of silence and simmering frustration. Her friends were concerned, of course. They tried to be supportive, but they couldn't understand. How could they? They hadn't seen the shadow in the woods, hadn't felt the chilling presence, hadn't heard Martha's cryptic warnings. They hadn't stared into the abyss. Sarah found herself increasingly isolated, even in the midst of the bustling city. She'd go through the motions of her day, working, eating, sleeping, but it was all a performance. Inside, she was still haunted by the woods, by Martha, by the unanswered questions. She started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams where she was back in the cabin, surrounded by darkness, pursued by unseen figures. She'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding like a drum. The lack of sleep, combined with the constant anxiety, began to take its toll. She lost weight. Her eyes became hollow. Her hands trembled. She was a shadow of her former self. One day, while browsing online, she stumbled across a local Oregon news archive. On a whim, she typed in Martha and the name of the nearest town to her cabin. She wasn't expecting anything, but she felt a compulsion to search, to find some shred of evidence, some confirmation that she wasn't crazy. And then she found it, an old newspaper article dated back over 50 years. The headline read, "Local Woman Vanishes in Cascade Mountains." The article described a woman named Martha Abernathy, a resident of a small, remote cabin, who had disappeared without a trace. The authorities had conducted an extensive search, but no sign of her was ever found. The case had gone cold. Sarah stared at the article, her blood turning to ice. The accompanying photograph showed a younger Martha, but it was unmistakably her. The same piercing eyes, the same strong jawline, the same unsettling presence. This changed everything. Martha wasn't just a crazy old woman. She was a ghost, a spirit, or something else entirely. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of purpose. She had to know the truth. She had to find out what had happened to Martha and what was really going on in those woods. She quit her job, packed her bags again, and this time, she didn't run away from the city. She ran toward the mountains. She knew it was irrational, possibly even dangerous, but she couldn't help herself. The mystery of Martha, the mystery of the woods, had become an obsession. It was a puzzle she had to solve, even if it killed her. She returned to the small town near her cabin, the same town where she'd reported her experience to the skeptical police. This time, she didn't go to the authorities. She went to the local library. She spent days poring over old newspapers, historical records, anything she could find about Martha Abernathy and the surrounding area. She learned that Martha had been a recluse, a woman who lived alone in the woods, shunned by the local community. There were rumors about her, whispers of witchcraft, of strange rituals, of dealings with the old ways. The more Sarah learned, the more convinced she became that Martha's disappearance was connected to something dark, something supernatural. And the more she believed that the things in the woods were real. She also discovered something else, a local legend, a story passed down through generations, about a hidden place in the mountains, a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place where things could cross over. The legend spoke of a circle of stones, a sacred site used by ancient Native American tribes for rituals and ceremonies. The site was said to be cursed, haunted by spirits, both benevolent and malevolent. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The circle of stones, the bones, Martha's words, they're always here, always watching, always waiting. It all started to make sense in a terrifying, illogical way. Martha hadn't been warning her about wild animals or even about other people. She'd been warning her about them, the spirits, the things that lived in the shadows. Armed with this new knowledge, Sarah decided to do something incredibly reckless. She decided to find the circle of stones. She decided to go back to Martha's abandoned cabin. She knew it was dangerous. She knew she might be walking into a trap, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know the truth. She had to face her fears. She found the cabin again, this time without the map. It was even more dilapidated than before, almost swallowed by the encroaching forest. The circle of stones was still there, the bones undisturbed. Sarah stood at the edge of the circle, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a strange energy emanating from the stones, a tingling sensation that ran through her body. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and spoke. "Martha," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you here?" Silence. She tried again, louder this time. "Martha, I know you're here. I know what happened to you. I want to help." Still nothing. Sarah felt a wave of disappointment. She'd been so sure, so convinced that she would find answers here. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, carried on the wind. Leave, asterisk. Sarah's eyes snapped open. She looked around wildly, but she was alone. Leave this place. It is not for you, asterisk. The voice was ethereal, disembodied, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah felt a surge of terror, but also a strange sense of understanding. They're watching. They are waiting, asterisk. Sarah knew in that moment that she had to go. She had to leave this place and never come back. She turned and fled, running faster than she'd ever run before. She didn't stop until she was back on the main road, back in her car, driving away from the mountains as fast as the engine would allow. She never looked back. Sarah never found all the answers. She never fully understood what happened to Martha, or what the things in the woods truly were. But she knew with absolute certainty that some mysteries are best left unsolved. Some doors are best left unopened. She returned to the city, but she was no longer the same person. The experience had changed her forever. She had faced her fears, and she had survived. But she had also learned a valuable lesson, that there are some things in this world that are beyond our comprehension, some forces that are best left undisturbed. The woods, it turns out, are much safer than she imagined, as she had survived. But would they be there waiting for her if she returned? Probably. And sometimes, when the city is quiet and the moon is full, she thinks she can still hear the whisper of the wind through the trees, carrying Martha's warning. Leave this place. It is not for you. It was not her warning, though. Sarah knew, as the voice was of something much, much older.